Tom Elliott.
Okay, this Saturday Qantas will operate an almost 20-hour non-stop flight from New York to Sydney. I don't know if it's going to have passengers on board. I suspect not, but they're really testing this new generation of Boeing twin-engine jets that can fly ultra-long distances. And the pilots union, which represents the pilots, is a little bit concerned. Our next guest is aviation expert from airlineinsider.com.au, Brian Wilson. Good afternoon.
Welcome aboard, Tom.
Now, I mean, obviously we already have long-haul flights. There's been a Perth to London flight for, I think, a year or two now. But, I mean, on a 20-plus hour non-stop flight, do you have the same pilot or pilots the whole way, or do they bring a couple of crews on board?
Well, Tom, this is the whole thing about it. In Australia, pilots are actually, by law, limited to a 20-hour duty, and that allows half an hour pre-flight and half an hour post-flight. So on these particular trial flights, it's actually a volunteer crew. In fact, there's two sets of crews that are actually doing it in order to comply. But that's the big issue. 26 hours in the air, a 26-hour duty, and considering the fact that, you generally end up with about 24 to 32 hours in a hotel before you turn around and do it again, and then 24 hours at home and you're back out again. I think the pilots are actually raising some very real concerns.
And it's one of those jobs where being at the top of your game is fairly important, because if something goes wrong, the after effects can be catastrophic. I mean, if I didn't sleep for 24 hours and had to do my radio show, it would not be the same as if I'd had a good night's sleep. So how do the pilots cope? They're landing the plane at Heathrow. They haven't slept in 24 hours. That can't be safe, can it?
No, well, look, not at all. And in fact, that's why on board there are crew rest facilities, and they'll have generally two and a half or a 3 hour break. If they're lucky, they might get a second one, but generally that tends to be fairly rare. So that's actually quite a concern. But also the concern goes for what happens in the cabin, because unlike the pilots, the cabin crew have no mandated duty limits. And at the end of the day, it's the cabin crew that are your doctors, your security people, your first aid people, and so overall, between both pilots and cabin crew, these sorts of flights can actually put the passengers at extreme risk.
So you could have a cabin crew member as serving the drinks and cleaning out the sick bags and all the other things that go on, dealing with screaming babies. They could work for 26 hours straight.
Yeah, well, and again, they have on some of the flights they have seats that they can sit in for a rest. On others, they'll have a bunk, but generally there are no fatigue limits and there are no fatigue laws in Australia.
Now, what about the planes themselves? I mean, I think it's amazing that we now have a twin-engine airliner that might fly those long distances. But I mean, are they getting down to their last 5 minutes of fuel by the time they land?
Well, these particular flights, they're on the edge of the range of the 787s. And in terms of it, I think these trials are also about Qantas upping the ante between Boeing and Airbus in terms of the tender of the new planes that they'll actually purchase to fly these particular long-haul routes. But at the end of the day, they're still flying roughly at the same speed, so they're not flying any faster. You're still travelling across the ground relatively at around about 800 kilometres an hour. So it is a case of literally stacking on more fuel to be able to fly these longer distances.
All right, thank you, Brian. Brian Wilson, aviation expert from airlineinsider.com.au. I haven't even thought about that. So the stewards and stewardesses, as they're called in America, where they still use gender-specific, pronouns, they could conceivably be working for 26, 27 hours straight. Pilots might get a 2 or 3 hour rest in the middle of the flight, but even then, I mean, landing a plane, I would have thought, is not the easiest thing in the world to do. 96900 693 13 13 32, and the plane itself could be quite literally flying on fumes towards the end. Is our desire to get to these places in one hop outstripping the technology available? Okay, calls coming up. Anything you want to discuss at 4:45.